The Appalachian Mountains keep their secrets well. Hidden among the hollows and backwoods where cabins lean under the weight of centuries, lies a story America has long pretended never happened. It is not folklore, nor the invention of cruel gossip. It is the documented life of a man who crossed the final line of human taboo. He married his own sister. The townsfolk remembered the wedding as something between a spectacle and a curse. No preacher dared officiate, so the union was carried out in a quiet cabin by lantern light. The only witnesses were kin, too frightened or too dependent to object. Whispers spread quickly that their children would be born broken, that God himself would strike them down. Yet the pair lived on, defying the warnings, raising generation after generation inside their isolated world. For outsiders, it was an abomination. For them, it was simply survival. In a land where neighbors were scarce and family ties were all that existed, blood became the only currency left to spend. Each child carried not only the genetic burden of their parents, but the weight of a community too terrified to intervene. This story is not about scandal. It is about how silence breeds monsters. And as we peel back the layers of this union, we uncover not just a family's shame, but a country's refusal to confront its darkest truths. The sister's name, Eliza, is mostly lost now, buried under layers of rumor and half-forgotten court records. But what remains is enough to sketch her life in broad, haunting strokes. She was quiet, slight of build, a woman who had been trained from childhood to obey. In her world, family was not just blood. It was law, and law could not be questioned. He was her brother, Silas, older by a few years, already hardened by work in the fields and by a suspicion of outsiders that bordered on obsession. To him, the idea of marrying anyone beyond the family seemed impossible. Travel meant risk. Outsiders meant betrayal. The only ones he trusted were the ones who carried the same last name as his own. The marriage was not romantic in any way we would recognize today. It was practical. It was survival. But survival came at a price, and that price was the slow unraveling of the children who came from it. Neighbors would later recall strange features: crossed eyes that seemed permanently unfocused, twisted spines, speech that stuttered and broke like a record skipping. Still, no one stepped in. 19th-century Appalachia was no place for moral crusades. Families lived and died in silence, and what happened behind cabin doors was considered no one's business. If children came out deformed, people shrugged and said, "That's just how the blood runs." But for this family, the blood didn't just run thin. It began to poison itself. The first whispers began not in the family's own home, but in the church pews. Small communities had sharp eyes and sharper tongues. People noticed how the couple never looked ashamed, never tried to hide the fact that they were brother and sister. They walked into Sunday service together, sat side by side, and received communion as if nothing about it was wrong. For the preacher, it was a dilemma. To call it out would mean confronting one of the strongest families in the holler, people who provided lumber, crops, and labor that the settlement depended on. To stay silent meant letting a sin fester in plain sight. In the end, silence won. The survival of the community outweighed the survival of moral law. Their children grew up marked by that silence. Each carried the burden not just of their twisted lineage, but of the unspoken agreement among neighbors that nothing was to be said. Teachers made excuses when a boy couldn't learn to read. Midwives bit their tongues when they saw another infant born with a cleft lip or malformed limbs. To speak would have been to unravel the fragile peace everyone lived under. And yet, as the years wore on, the cracks became harder to ignore. Some of the children didn't live past infancy. Others grew into adulthood only to suffer seizures or unexplained illnesses. The family line seemed cursed, but in truth, it wasn't curses or demons at work. It was blood turning in on itself, generation after generation, tightening the noose. It was here, in this uneasy silence, that the story of their union shifted from mere gossip to whispered horror. By the time the oldest son reached manhood, the family's reputation was no longer something whispered. It was branded on them. Children in the village gave him cruel nicknames. Merchants hesitated before trading with him, glancing at his heavy brow and his uneven features as if starring too long might reveal their own fates. But what shocked outsiders most was not the deformities themselves. It was the family's pride. They didn't cower. They didn't apologize. Instead, they doubled down, claiming their bloodline was pure because it was untouched by outsiders. To them, the outside world carried corruption, sin, and weakness. Keeping blood within the family wasn't a shame. It was a declaration of superiority. This mindset gave them a strange, almost cult-like aura. Every decision from marriage to childbirth was framed as destiny. Daughters were told from childhood who they would marry, and it was never someone beyond the family tree. Sons were told the same. There was no choice, no courtship, only the tightening circle of kinship passed off as tradition. Neighbors began to fear more than pity them. There was something unsettling about the way the siblings carried themselves, unbothered, almost defiant. If challenged, they didn't argue with logic. They argued with the weight of their numbers, their farmland, their presence. They controlled acres of timberland, barns full of livestock, and fields others relied on for food. Confronting them meant risking survival. And so the family grew, generation after generation, bound tighter by blood and by silence. Outsiders might have seen deformities, but inside the house they saw something else: loyalty at all costs, unity against the world. It was this warped sense of unity that would lead them further down a path darker than anyone could have imagined. By the way, which city are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments below. The strangest part wasn't just the family's survival, it was their flourishing. By the mid-century, their land stretched wider than most neighboring farms. They produced more crops, raised stronger cattle, and seemed in some twisted way untouchable. People whispered that it wasn't hard work alone that kept them afloat. It was fear. Workers who once dared to leave their farm returned after threats, or worse, after their barns mysteriously caught fire in the night. Rival families who spoke too boldly against them suddenly found themselves cut off from grain shipments or timber deals. The clan, mocked in secret, held an iron grip on the very lifeline of the community. Yet inside their house, the cracks were undeniable. Children were born who couldn't walk until much later than expected. Some couldn't speak clearly. Others bore faces that revealed, without question, the generations of intermarriage. These things were not hidden. They were simply accepted. A child who couldn't hold a plow would be hidden indoors, while those who appeared more normal were paraded as proof that the family was thriving. It was a world of contrasts: strength and fragility, power and deformity, pride and decay. Neighbors wrestled with their unease. How could people so visibly marked by degeneration still wield such control? The contradiction gnawed at the community's conscience, but no one dared say it aloud. To the family, each birth, no matter how tragic, was another stone in the fortress of their name. They saw destiny where others saw disaster, and the more outsiders recoiled, the more fiercely the family clung to its own twisted logic. But every empire built on fear eventually finds its breaking point. For this family, the unraveling would come from within. The breaking point did not arrive with a bang. It came as a whisper that spread like a sickness. One winter, a daughter who had been married to her own brother fell into a violent fever. Some claimed it was influenza. Others swore it was punishment from God. What made the town shiver wasn't her death. It was what followed. Her infant son, barely able to hold his head upright, carried the unmistakable features of their lineage. His eyes were too far apart, his jaw underdeveloped, his cries strangely weak. The neighbors who came to pay respects left in silence, glancing at one another with a shared, unspoken truth. This was no ordinary tragedy. This was the living evidence of a family eating itself alive. For the first time, whispers began to swell into open conversation. Ministers spoke cautiously about unnatural unions in their sermons. Midwives, once discreet, began recounting the alarming conditions of the children they had delivered. What had long been tolerated as a bizarre quirk of isolation was transforming into something impossible to ignore, a blight on the community's very soul. Inside the family home, paranoia grew. Brothers accused sisters of gossip. Fathers warned sons not to speak to outsiders. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and the children, the broken, the deformed, the silent, were hidden deeper than ever before. Every glance from a neighbor felt like a judgment. Every whisper in the church pew felt like a dagger aimed straight at them. It was as if the walls of their house were closing in, suffocating them under the weight of their own secret. And yet, even as the world seemed ready to turn against them, they clung to the very practice that had birthed their downfall. Because in their minds this wasn't shame, it was destiny. The community's patience eventually cracked. What had once been murmurs in the church pews became open defiance. Men who had sat silent at town meetings now spoke plainly. This family was a stain, a danger, and perhaps even a curse. Women refused to let their children near the homestead. Farmers avoided trading with them, leaving the family to scrape together survival from their own failing land. But it wasn't just outside pressure that made the house rot. It was what happened within. The children, raised in an atmosphere of suspicion and fear, grew restless. Some were withdrawn and blank-eyed, while others simmered with violent outbursts that frightened even their own parents. Arguments turned to fists, and fists turned to blood. A father once struck his own son so brutally that the boy lost hearing in one ear. No one outside the walls ever knew until the boy began wandering town, half-deaf, speaking in broken sentences that only deepened the whispers. The isolation, once a source of control, became unbearable. Locked doors and shuttered windows could not block out the fact that the town was watching them with a mix of horror and disgust. The family's name became synonymous with corruption, and their children were treated like walking omens, proof of what happens when boundaries, both moral and natural, are ignored. The family elders clung stubbornly to their ways, insisting this was strength, not sickness. But even their own offspring began to rebel. Some tried to run away, only to be dragged back under the threat of violence. Others succeeded, leaving behind everything but the scars they carried with them. And with every runaway, every wandering child, every malformed infant buried in secret soil, the outside world came closer to knowing the full truth. The house could no longer contain it. The legacy of secrecy was collapsing, and soon, the entire town would be forced to confront what had been festering for generations.